So, what is it like to be an average citizen when terrorist attacks take place in one's city, one's hometown? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Canada, and you're listening to Canadian Intelligence, which is a longer conversation with guests about all things terrorism related. As somebody who worked in counterterrorism for 15 years, who worked in intelligence for 32 years, it's ironic in some ways that when an actual act of terrorism took place in the city where I lived, i.e., at the time, Ottawa, Canada, the capital of Canada, I wasn't there. It was an attack that took place in late October of 2014 when a man killed a corporal at the National War Memorial and then proceeded to try and storm Parliament before he was essentially shot down in a hail of bullets. And while that attack was taking place, 2 blocks from where I was working, I was actually on the highway briefing Ontario provincial police officers on radicalisation and terrorism. And so by the time I got back to Ottawa, the whole thing had kind of, passed over and we're moving on. I'm always curious to hear what terrorism is like for people who are experiencing, who do not work in counterterrorism, who do not work in law enforcement, who do not work in intelligence. And in this regard, I'm very delighted to have with me as a guest today a young woman I'm going to call Lou, who is from Belgium, and she wants to talk a little. We're going to talk a little bit about some of her experiences in what was happening in the sort of mid 2010s when there was a wave of terrorist attacks that took part in her country. So, Lou, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Let's go a little further back. And I'm going to guess that when 9/11 occurred, you were a very, very young person. Do you have any distinct memories at all of what happened on 9/11, even though you were nowhere close to New York or Washington? Do you have any memories from that time?
I actually remember it very, very clearly. Yeah, I was 6 years old, and I remember coming home from school. I think it was lunchtime. We had kind of a short day at school that day, and I remember being on the school bus on the way home, and I knew that my father was in Washington for work. And I remember hearing on the Francophone radio station that there was a bomb in Washington. That's how it was initially reported. Um, and I remember I got off the bus and my mum was there waiting to pick me up. And I said, "Oh, mum, there's been a bomb in Washington. We should make sure that dad's okay." And she kind of took my hand and said, "Yeah, of course, we'll give him a ring. Don't worry, it'll be absolutely fine." And we walked home and she tried to ring my dad at his hotel and she couldn't get through. The phone lines were down. And she thought, okay, that's quite odd. And rather than kind of panicking, she said, "Well, we'll just turn on the television
Oh,
and we'll just see
no.
what's going on." And I remember her really, really clearly turning on the TV, and she just sat there and didn't really move for a few hours. And, I think about kind of 10 minutes into watching, I didn't really understand. And I sort of said, "Oh, can I go upstairs and watch some cartoons?" And she kind of said, "Yeah, go upstairs and, put on Cartoon Network." So, yeah, I remember it like it was yesterday. It was really surreal.
Wow. So you actually had a direct family connection in that your father was in the United States on business. And clearly your mom is trying to understand what's just happened, how she's worried about her husband, your father, but not trying to betray to you the fact that she's worried. And obviously at the age of 6, you wouldn't be able to understand the enormity of what happened. So she was basically trying to kind of say, "Oh, it's okay. You can go watch cartoons and I'll just kind of sit here." Do you remember what
Yeah.
happened sort of in the immediate aftermath of that as the day went on?
So I remember that she was trying to get through for a little while, and this was kind of, I don't even think she had an email address at the time. She's more kind of online now that she could have maybe gotten through, but she was trying to get through and she saw that the phone lines were down. And I think eventually she managed to get through to the reception of the hotel. And he had eventually communicated to her that, everything was okay. But I think she was sitting watching the TV when the second plane hit, potentially. I can't
Mm.
remember the exact timeline, but I think there was very much a sense of, kind of watching as things unfolded. And I remember that my dad, for a couple of weeks afterwards, even though he was due to fly home, ended up getting stuck in the
Hmm.
States. And for whatever reason, I remember this very clearly, when he finally got through, he told my mother to go to the nearest cash machine and take out some money, um, a few thousand euros. I don't know why. I think he had a sense that, World Trade Center, that, the economy was about to be severely compromised, because at this point the news had kind of filtered its way to him. And so I think that was just kind of an impulsive response that he had. And I remember at the time also thinking that that was strange, a strange behavior, even though I couldn't really put two and two together in my mind as to why that would be the case, or why that would be something that he would suggest.
Wow, that's fascinating. I never heard of that kind of reaction before. I mean, it makes sense if you think about it. If there'd been this incredible strike, not just against American military power and, in theory, American political power, because that's where the fourth plane we believe was headed for before it was hijacked by or rehijacked rather, by the passengers, and of course the economic power represented by the World Trade Center. It doesn't strike me as odd at all that someone would draw the conclusion that the world economy might be affected for the couple of weeks, couple of months. So your father's reaction is actually kind of makes a lot of sense in hindsight.
Yeah, yeah.
So moving forward, Lou, I mean, you say you're 6 years old. So okay, this too shall pass. When you're growing up in Western Europe in the 2000s and the early 2010s, do you really, you or your friends, your classmates, does terrorism really mean anything to you? Is it something that ever comes up in conversation? Obviously, 9/11 was sort of the high point, or maybe the low point, depending on your perspective, in terms of casualties. But there were attacks all through the 2000s and the early 2010s, not just in the parts of the world we normally associate it with, i.e., Afghanistan, parts of Africa, etc., but much of the Western world, the attacks in London in 2005, etc. Does this have any play at all in your understanding of the world as you're going through elementary and secondary schools?
So I remember in primary school, we were shortly after 9/11 instructed to have a minute of silence. And I remember we were all kind of brought out into the kind of school playground and, asked to sit down and to pay our respects. And it was quite interesting because I think within our kind of year group, there were people with a very kind of keen sense of what had happened and its importance, even at that
Mm-hmm.
young age when you don't really understand the specifics of it, and people who were a lot more oblivious. And I think I was more in that group that was quite aware of things, and quite affected by things because of my father's kind of personal connection. Because he was also actually working with the American military at the time on a
Mm-hmm.
project. Um, and so he was actually staying very near the Pentagon when it happened, only about a
Mm-hmm.
mile away. And kind of retroactively, we realized that he had probably heard the plane going over and kind of
Wow.
suffered some very mild effects of PTSD after that, in which if he read, for example, a report about the events of that day, or saw some imagery, that he could actually smell this kind of burning fuel smell very strongly. And he never knew what it was. And eventually, a doctor had kind of diagnosed it as this sort of subconscious traumatic reaction, because his brain hadn't processed it at the time, which I think is quite interesting just on a sort of physiological level
Right.
as well. So I think I was quite aware of it. My parents never restricted my access to the news media, which I think you could criticize but also praise in some way. I
Mm-hmm.
still haven't come to a conclusion as to whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. I
Mm-hmm.
had a very kind of heightened anxiety around certain things as a child because of that. But I also feel that kind of ultimately it's given me quite an understanding and an appreciation of just everything that is going on a global scale. So I don't really want to kind of, you know,
Mm-hmm.
criticize them for that. But I remember, for example, the Chechen
Yes.
siege
In
in
Beslan. Yeah.
Beslan.
Mm-hmm.
That was very, very kind of impactful to me because it was a school.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was a primary school as
Mm-hmm.
well. So
Yes, it
that
was.
to me very much felt like, an act of terror, an act of violence that was encroaching on a space that I always considered to be safe.
Mhm.
And what is quite interesting is that it was towards the end of me being in secondary school, we actually then began to have sort of an armed guard presence in our school.
An armed
Um,
guard presence in your school.
yeah, so we always had 12-hour a day security. It was kind of a private school for all intents and purposes, and a lot of children of diplomats, politicians
Mm.
went there, bureaucrats. And we noticed that eventually this kind of security had ramped up, and suddenly they were not just kind of confined to the school gates where they would monitor people coming in and out, but also walking around the campus of the school. And I got into a conversation with one man one day, and I sort of said, oh, is there any reason? We've noticed that you're here. And he said, well, we've had some people phoning up and making some threats, and we don't know
Wow.
if it's serious or not, but they felt that it was necessary to bring people in. Um, so I think that that's quite interesting, and that very much brought that whole like theatre of, even though they were private security guards, but like
Mm.
policing and protection into the school space, which was quite shocking to me, at least. Um,
Wow, I never would have thought armed guards in schools in Belgium. You hear about it in the States all the time, but that's because there's such an open gun culture in the United States, and there have been massive. Think Sandy Hook, think of Columbine. There's been all kinds of school shootings in the United States. We've had one or two here in Canada as well. Just as a tangent, Lou, I mean, are school shootings ever have they ever been an issue in Belgium?
No, I don't believe so. I don't think we've ever had any instances of that. But I do know that in Belgium, it's particularly easy to procure firearms. And I think part of that is a legacy of the Balkan conflict in the
Mm.
90s. But it's also that when certain firearms were outlawed, there was sort of a retroactive system where you could surrender them, but most people didn't. And so there are, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of
Mm.
thousands of unregistered firearms that are circulating in Belgium. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay, so let's move forward a bit. So you were talking so far about your reaction to 9/11, albeit as a what sounds like a pretty precocious 6-year old, as well as your reaction to Beslan in the early 2000s. By the mid 2010s, terrorism has unfortunately come to Brussels. Now, it wasn't the first time there have been terrorist attacks in Belgium, but I think these are pretty well probably the most significant Islamist extremist attack. So in 2014, there was an attack on a Jewish museum. Of course, the big attacks in it was 2016, right? It was the airport and the metro, in which more than 30 people died and 300 over 300 were wounded. So you're a lot older by this point. So can walk us through what it was like to be in Brussels at the time of those, especially the 2016 attacks, which were significant. I'm not sure if you call them. There's this tendency to call everything something 11 to compare it to 9/11, but I'm pretty sure that those attacks in Belgium did resonate with the population as a whole. What are your memories of those days?
Yeah, so interestingly, the 2016 attacks, I was not in Belgium. I was in France, and my parents were in Belgium. I was in Belgium having just been discharged from hospital back in 2015 when we had the first military lockdown as a response to the Paris attacks,
Right.
where they thought that Abdeslam was going to cross back over the border. And of course, we know that he was in Belgium and, hiding under
Mm-hmm.
everyone's noses for
These, of
some
course, are
time.
these are November 2015 attacks in the Bataclan and Stade de France, and I was actually in Paris the day of those attacks, although I flew out for Canada 10 hours before they occurred. So once again, for someone who works in counterterrorism, I was in kind of the right place at the right time, but not quite. But sorry, go ahead.
No, no. Yeah, and actually, I was at the fast food restaurant that was blown up at the Stade de France about a week before, as well. The Paris attacks. So that feels really strange as well. Um, so I was in France. I had just gone to my parents have a place there, and I'd just kind of gone there with my partner at the time, and we were going to have a calm holiday. We were going to enjoy having the house to ourselves, and this news came through of this attack that happened in Brussels. And I remember I phoned my parents and I said, right, come down to France right now. I felt that I did not want them in Brussels because although those two attacks happened in quick succession on the same day, I was concerned that there might be some kind of coordinated, more extended kind of domino effect, I guess. Although you could argue perhaps that the safest time to be somewhere is right after an attack, right? When all the security gets stepped up.
Exactly. Yeah.
It was pretty shocking, but I have to say that when it happened in Brussels, there was an overwhelming sense, at least in my immediate network, that it had finally happened, in that this was expected and we knew it was going to happen at some stage, and it was just a matter of when, not a matter of if. I think after the Paris attacks, obviously Belgium was very much in the media spotlight, and that shone a lot of, quite negative information on the way that the Belgian authorities were perhaps handling things or not handling things very well at the time, and also that Belgium had some very deep rooted issues with kind of extremists using it as a kind of safe space, but also with a kind of general lack of direction from above, of politicians facing this issue, and of trying to deal with it in a constructive way. So I think in Belgium there tends to be a culture of denial and a culture of, it's not my problem. I remember the mayor of Molenbeek, basically saying, when she was confronted about this watch list of people, and she sort of said, well, it's not my job to keep track of terrorists, right? And that's kind of quite representative of an overarching attitude. I've had personal encounters with the Belgian police as well. They are notoriously, quite crooked, I would say, quite corrupt. And there's a general understanding, even for sort of expats, that you don't go to the police if you're having a problem. You don't report something to the police because they're not going to help you. So if it's the case for expats, you can only imagine, for example, marginalized communities and the mistrust and the suspicion with which they would regard the police. And I remember at the time as well, a lot of people within the Islamic community in Brussels were saying, we're caught between Daesh, that sees us as non-believers because we don't want to go and fight in Syria, and we live these kind of more secularized, integrated lives. But we're also caught between that and the Belgian institutions and the Belgian police that do broadly regard us as part of the problem and treat us as though we're part of the problem and not part of the pushback and the solution. So I think there was a lot of generalized frustration from all sides. And I think that the attacks in 2016 kind of brought a lot of that to the surface, and at least forced, in the most awful and violent way, a conversation around some of those issues that had been simmering for a long time.
Now, in an earlier conversation that you and I had, you also talked about some interesting reactions at the official level by the Belgian government in the aftermath of some of the attacks. And I believe you mentioned something about there's a recommendation by the government that average citizens acquire dosages of iodine tablets, which seems to suggest that they are worried about some kind of a chemical or biological attack. Can you walk me through that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe it was after the Paris attacks, it was revealed that they had found surveillance footage of kind of suspected fundamentalists that had been filming a higher level nuclear official at his home. This footage was recovered, I think, in February 2015 or 2016, perhaps. I'm not sure on the exact timeline, but there was a general sense that this was potentially going to lead to some sort of attack. Now, the other interesting thing that happened was that a security official for one of the nuclear power plants had been killed. And there were reports that his identity card was stolen, his sort of clearance pass. And the police have always said that it has nothing to do with any of the surveillance that was going on. But I think it was either very strange timing or potentially there was a link that has never been proven. But the government actually didn't just recommend for Belgians to acquire iodine tablets, but they actually made a provision for every Belgian citizen within 100 kilometres. So initially it was going to be a 20-kilometre radius of any nuclear facilities. I believe they eventually extended that to 100 kilometres and actually allocated them iodine pills, which would be then dispensed from their local pharmacies in the event of an attack. They put out guidelines saying that pregnant women and breastfeeding mothers would be first in line. Mm-hmm. So it was quite a shocking move. I can't see that a national government would do that if they didn't have a real reason to fear something like that.
Right.
And what surprised me at the time was I was finishing up my degree in London. It didn't really make it to British news outlets. So it was widely reported in Belgium, but didn't seem to kind of make it beyond that. So I thought that was quite interesting as well. And
I do
of course,
remember when you mentioned that to.
Sorry, go
Sorry,
on.
I do mention I do remember when you mentioned that to me in a conversation. I racked my brain thinking if I had heard of that, because I mean at the time that would have been just as I was retiring from the Canadian Civil Service, but still keeping an eye on what's happening around the world in terms of terrorism and counterterrorism. And I don't recall that ever coming across my news feed, so it probably wasn't picked up. And you're right, it is an extraordinary move for government to make, and one would hope that the move was made only after having considered very carefully what the intelligence was saying, what the investigations were saying, because I would imagine that an announcement of that kind could in fact lead to mass panic across the Belgian population. And I want to pick up on something that you wrote to me earlier, where you talked about how terrorist attacks have this ability to, quote, infiltrate our emotional lives and our collective conscience. Can you sort of talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and sort of how your experiences in Belgium have maybe led you to some kind of an insight or understanding about the real effects that terrorism have on the lives of ordinary people?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know through your career and through all of the work that you've done that the statistical probabilities of being caught up in such an attack are incredibly small, and therefore to genuinely hold that as a sort of fear that you walk around with day to day, for it to stop you from doing certain things, taking planes, going to concerts, taking part in all of those kind of very normal activities is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I have in the past, and I know people, and I consider myself to be, fairly, fairly well-rounded and well-adjusted. We do let it sometimes change our behavior, and these are events that really sit with us. And I think what's interesting is in my kind of day job, as you said, I really don't do anything related to terrorism, related to conflict. But what I do look at a lot is the power of images,
Mm-hmm.
and the power of the way that those images are beamed out to us. And I think what is quite worrying, or what I don't see kind of spoken about enough, is the fact that these images from attacks, the iconic image of the Twin Towers, for example, the falling man, they're beamed out to us constantly. We can't really escape them if we want to, stay informed as citizens, watch the news, read newspapers, go online. And yet, when people do kind of outwardly display an emotional response to those things by kind of openly mourning the victims of these attacks, for example, or expressing kind of their fear and their dismay that such a thing could happen, the response that it tends to get met with is, well, what about all the violence that's going on in XYZ?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, of course, there's a valid point there to be made, but I think that ultimately that's quite a damaging way to handle things, right? Because in a sort of Western peaceful context, these attacks should shock us. in this context, and we should be allowed to have a very human response to them. And I don't think it's fair to equate that impact with a kind of moral disregard for violence elsewhere. I don't think that's a fair way of looking at things and interpreting things. You know, when things are close to home or feel closer to home, we interpret them very differently. And I think,
Right.
you know, that we should allow that to actually humanize our understanding of the broader global stage, rather than engaging in this idea that if you're upset by an attack in your hometown, but you're not equally as upset about something that is happening, you know, in a conflict halfway around the world in a country that you've never been to, that somehow that means you don't have that same level of humanity.
Right.
Um, and so I kind of have forgotten the original question.
No, I think you raise a really interesting point, and this is an age-old question, right? You see suffering in a land far away, and I'll give you a concrete example. When I was quite young, when I was in primary school, the big issue was Biafra, which was it's a state in Nigeria, and there was a civil war going on, and there was a famine that resulted from that civil war. And I remember as a 7, 8, 9 year old seeing images on television about children with distended bellies in Nigeria, and can Canadians help send money to X, Y, or Z charitable organization, religious organization, whatever. And I remember at the time thinking, well, who are these people, and how does it affect me personally? And don't we have? And there's always that counter argument. Well, there's always suffering at home. We both live in relatively prosperous Western secular liberal democratic societies, but they're not perfect. And there's this constant demand to fix your own neighborhood before you go fix somebody else's, sort of thing. So I think that's kind of you raise some interesting points, Lou, about this, our ability to identify and personalize what's happening to a people very, very far away. You don't want to ignore the injustices, especially in cases where you can have an impact. But then again, you look at sort of, this brings in the bigger question of sort of the so-called war on terrorism since 9/11, and a lot of the moves and decisions that were made in the hope of being productive have in fact turned out to be quite counterproductive, such as the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. So I guess the question then remains, is there maybe not a limit to human compassion, but is there sort of an inherent, I don't know, preference for being able to reach out and do something about what's happening in your backyard versus what's happening 7,000 kilometers away?
It's a really difficult one, and I would never profess to have all the answers, but I think that the imagery and the story of these attacks that are happening closer to home should be teaching us something about the human condition, and should be teaching us something about, you know, the capacity for human beings to move towards kind of violent acts. And I think that should be encouraging, in theory, a discussion around how we stop that from
Mm-hmm.
happening. And instead, what I see, unfortunately, is, you know, on the right wing side of things, there's very much a kind of, tarnish everyone with the same brush sort of mentality, a lot of kind of prejudice there towards different religions, different races, people from different places around the world. And then on the left, you have this sort of moralizing,
Mm.
wokeness
Yeah.
of if you are upset by something that's happening on your own turf, but you aren't, as vocal about things happening elsewhere, that you are kind of a moral non-entity. And I find it quite frustrating, because I don't consider myself to be on either of those
Mm.
sides of things. And I think what's interesting about the war on terror, and maybe the kind of way that its timeline has aligned with my life, is that when 9/11 happened, I think that was my realization that people could do very bad things.
Mm-hmm.
That was me kind of suddenly understanding the scale of, human violence, and seeing those images. And our ethics teacher showed us United 93 when we were 9 years old. in primary school.
Oh my Lord.
I have been terrified to take a plane ever since. I mean, really kind of crazy stuff. But I think that's interesting. So that was kind of a nexus point for me. And then I think as obviously we invaded Iraq, I remember kind of watching the coffins coming home draped in
Yeah.
the British flag, being offloaded from aircraft carriers. But then as that then evolved, I've Abu Ghraib, those images came
Yeah.
out. And then the most potent imagery for me started to change, and it became Abu Ghraib and the abuse and the kind of disregard of human rights, Guantanamo Bay's orange jumpsuits.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it kind of taught me that humanity is not as black and white as we think. It taught me about nuance, and the war on terror really showed me that the institutions that are there to protect us, that we're supposed to trust and that are supposed to
Mm-hmm.
be held accountable to the public, that's not always the case. Millions of people marched against the war in Iraq, and that
Yeah.
did not dissuade the government from going in.
Yeah.
And it also taught me, the Arab Spring taught me the power of people coming together to overthrow a regime and, to try and forge a better future of themselves, but then also of the kind of volcanistic reaction of that, of all of
Mm-hmm.
these other conflicts
Mm-hmm.
coming up. And then Daesh taught me that human beings are actually just as capable of medieval violence as we were,
In
you
medieval
know,
times.
years ago. Yeah, exactly. So I think the chronology has been very interesting, and I think at every point it has helped to kind of shape the way that I see the world through the way that events have unfolded. And I think ultimately my one takeaway is that things are never as simple as we think
Mm-hmm.
they are, and there is
Yeah.
a huge amount of grey area and a huge amount of nuance that's involved at every level. And yet the way that I see popular culture and kind of mass media tending towards is moving away from nuance. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why I think projects like yours are so important, because you're actually there to encourage that discourse and accept that there is a conversation to be had, rather than brushing things under the carpet or coming up with overly simplistic explanations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think it's such a brilliant thing and such an important thing.
Well, thank you for that. As I've always said, life always is multiple shades of gray. I should say there's 50 shades of gray, but someone stole that title for something completely unrelated to what I'm talking
Oh,
about
you
here.
used it better, Phil, I think.
Lou, it's been a delight having you on and listening to you. For someone that has absolutely zero role in counterterrorism or national security, I think you may come across as one of the wisest persons I've ever spoken to on this topic. And I really appreciate you just sharing, your views as an informed citizen who's lived through terrorist attacks in the city that you were living in. You have these memories of 9/11, and yet you can speak very honestly and I think straightforwardly on the mistakes that were made, like the invasion of Iraq, like like Guantanamo Bay, and like Abu Ghraib. So I cannot thank you enough for taking the time out of your very busy day for joining me on this podcast.
Oh, thank you, Phil. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's nice to not just talk about clothes for a day.
So that was my conversation with Lou, a woman that has reached out to me after having heard some of my podcast. What about you? Are you in a similar situation where you've had experiences with terrorism and counterterrorism? I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me on email borealisrisk@gmail.com or on Twitter @borealissaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content and want to get more, go to the website borealisthreatrisk.com. There's a subscribe button there. You get all this content free of charge, podcasts, blogs. There's also a list to my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, History of Terrorism in Canada, from Confederation to the present, told through the eyes and ears of the women and men who worked in counterterrorism. And also a note that we go live on Mondays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern in a podcast called Who Terrorized Who Tonight, but all things national security related. Love to hear your feedback. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.